I was standing in a 7-Eleven in Shinjuku, maybe 2 a.m. recently, and I was just watching the clerk. He was so methodically restocking this row of perfectly aligned rice balls.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this specific kind of silence in Tokyo at that hour. It's profound, almost this heavy sense of safety.
Right. For decades, that's been the whole point. That's the peace dividend you can actually feel.
Exactly. It's the invisible foundation of a society that decided, quite pragmatically, to just trade its national ego for the most efficient, comfortable domestic life on Earth.
Well, yeah, the peace constitution wasn't just some legal document for most people.
No, it was a strategy. It let Japan become this kind of civilization island, totally buckered from the world's chaos.
But that silence is changing.
It is. Outside the LDP headquarters later that week, that silence was just gone.
Yeah.
It was replaced by something else. I saw this group of elderly protesters.
And they're not who you'd typically expect to see.
Not at all. They didn't look like radicals. They looked like people who had just been told their life insurance policy was being canceled. And they were there because of one single staggering number, 9.04 trillion yen.
The proposed defense budget for 2026. A number that pushes Japan toward the psychological red line it hasn't even approached in, nearly 80 years.
And you hear politicians, people like Sane Takaichi, arguing that Japan has to tame the dragon, that it needs to finally embrace the role of a normal military power.
Which, in such a volatile neighborhood, sounds like a realist's necessity on the surface.
It does. But watching those protesters, I realized their fear wasn't about an invading army. It was about something closer to home, a domestic betrayal.
Because they see those trillions of yen not as shields or missiles,
but as stolen healthcare, managed elder care, the complete erosion of the social contract. Japan is staring down this demographic cliff. Birth rates are plummeting below 700,000.
And yet the government is choosing this exact moment to pivot, to go from being a protected fortress to a proactive player in a great power game.
So it raises this haunting question. Is Japan losing the very composure that made it so unique? By chasing hard sovereignty, are they accidentally destroying the soul of the country they're trying to defend?
That really captures the philosophical weight of this moment perfectly. Japan is, it's making an epochal shift.
It feels that way.
For the entire post-war era, the state's priority, its whole raison d'etre, was maximizing that peace dividend.
Right.
That meant channeling all the national energy, all the resources, entirely into domestic efficiency, into becoming an economic powerhouse. And it was all built on a foundation of guaranteed American security. That was the Yoshida Doctrine in a nutshell.
And now,
in response to what their policymakers see, and you can't really deny it, as the most dangerous and complex security environment since 1945, they are pivoting hard. They're moving toward what we call hard sovereignty.
They're choosing to become a futsuno kuni.
A normal nation. Exactly. Yeah. A nation that accepts military burdens and global security responsibilities. It's a reversal of 70 years of national identity.
And in doing that, they are cracking open 3 immense interconnected conflicts that are going to define the next generation of Japanese politics and society. Mm-hmm. So for this deep dive, we have to investigate all 3. First, there's the intense domestic financial strain. That staggering 9.04 trillion yen budget is like a wrecking ball aimed directly at social welfare in a super-aged society. It raises the specter of that domestic betrayal.
The trade-off is unavoidable.
Then, second, we have to look at the erosion of the post-war social contract itself. The deep-seated political conflict that comes from abandoning the pacifist identity that gave them so much domestic stability.
Or finally, the geopolitical picture.
Right, the geopolitical implications.
Yeah.
Japan is giving up its comfortable identity as a protected civilization island to pursue a proactive military role, which completely recalculates its standing in East Asia and, really, the world.
It's a fundamental reprioritization. They're swapping internal comfort for external deterrent.
Okay, so let's unpack this monumental shift. We can't understand the resistance we see in Shinjuku without first establishing the bedrock of Japan's post-war identity. Can you just lay out for us what the historical pillars of the Yoshida Doctrine were and why that philosophy worked for so long?
The Yoshida Doctrine, named after Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, was, above all else, a radical but successful strategic trade-off. It was born out of the ruins of the Second World War and the American occupation that followed.
And its core tenets were simple.
Incredibly simple and pragmatic. First, rapid economic recovery and growth had to be the absolute #1 priority for the state, period. Second, Japan would maintain a highly constrained, minimal defense posture.
And the third pillar, the most critical one,
The most critical, yes. Japan would rely almost entirely, if not completely, on the United States for its security, especially under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. This policy framework was just brilliant in its simplicity. It allowed Japan to channel every single available resource talent, capital, technological expertise away from building tanks and warships and into building the industries that fueled that post-war economic miracle.
So if the U.S. was providing the security shield, Japan was providing the economic engine. That makes Article 9 of the Constitution, the famous pacifist clause, more than just a legal document. It was an economic enabler.
That's a key insight, yes. The Constitution provided the legal constraint, but the policy mechanism that truly codified the strategy was the principle of Senshu Boe.
Exclusively defense-oriented policy.
Exactly. This principle meant that Japan could possess military capabilities only for self-defense. It strictly prohibited it from acquiring what we'd call offensive weapons, like long-range bombers or aircraft carriers.
So it couldn't threaten its neighbors.
It prevented Japan from launching a preemptive strike or developing any capability that could credibly threaten its neighbors. It was a foundational statement, rooted deeply in the post-war commitment to anti-militarism, designed to communicate to the world, especially to its Asian neighbors who had suffered under Japanese imperialism, that Japan would never again be an aggressive military power.
And the visible, quantifiable symbol of this commitment, that had to be the famous 1% cap.
Absolutely. The 1% limit on defense spending relative to GDP became the international visible guarantee of Japan's pacifism. Now, it's vital to understand that this cap was, well, it was entirely symbolic and artificial.
It had no real military logic behind it.
None. No military or fiscal logic. It was a purely political benchmark, intentionally designed to placate domestic pacifist sentiments and reassure neighboring states like South Korea and China. It became a powerful cultural artifact, a kind of metric of national sanity, proving that Japan hadn't slipped back into its militaristic past. It was upheld almost religiously for decades.
And this is where the narrative of this comfortable, efficient Japan starts to fracture. Because that comfortable doctrine was first traumatically challenged, not by a regional foe, but by an event far from Asia, the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991.
The Gulf War was a moment of profound national reckoning, a trauma, really. Japan, despite being the world's second largest economy at the time and completely dependent on Middle Eastern oil, adopted a strictly passive role.
Citing the Constitution.
Right. They offered no military personnel, but instead donated an immense sum. $13 billion in financial support to the U.S.-led coalition, and they thought this massive check would satisfy international demands.
It sounds like they fundamentally misunderstood the rules of the Global Security Club. What was the reaction?
International humiliation. Financial support, no matter how large, was seen as insufficient. Cowardly, even. The optics were just terrible. The Economist famously branded Japan the Scrooge of Asia.
Wow.
But the ultimate insult was that Kuwait, after its liberation, pointedly excluded Japan from its official expression of gratitude to the coalition members. This disgrace, this feeling of being rich but irrelevant, powerful economically but politically paralyzed, it sparked a massive domestic debate. The core question became, should Japan remain a passive merchant nation, hiding behind its constitutional restraints? Or should it evolve into a Futsuno Kuni normal nation that accepts the responsibilities and burdens that come with its economic size?
That national conversation, the Futsuno Kuni debate, that feels like the first true crack in the post-war foundation. So how did the political elites translate this desire for normalcy into actual policy changes that allowed them to start loosening those ironclad constitutional constraints?
It was a gradual process, almost stealthy, a process of constitutional reinterpretation led by sequential cabinet decisions. The key area they targeted was the concept of collective self-defense, CSD.
Okay, so traditionally, the Constitution was interpreted to mean Japan could only use force to defend itself if attacked directly.
Correct. But through these policy maneuvers over the last 3 decades, cabinet decisions gradually and virtually lifted the ban on the use of force, permitting the exercise of CSD.
So they didn't change the words of the Constitution, which would have required a difficult national referendum.
No, exactly. They just redefined what self-defense actually meant in practice.
They just changed the interpretation.
That's the perfect way to put it. They redefined it as permissible under the condition of an existential threat to Japan's survival. This means if an attack on a critical ally, specifically the U.S., threatens Japan's very existence, Japan can join the fight. This allowed them to pivot from solely territorial defense to supporting allies under very specific circumstances.
What's fascinating here is the political mechanism used to govern this newly claimed power. It sounds inherently destabilizing for future governments.
And that's the most critical point for the critics. This massive epochal shift in security policy hinges almost entirely on the subjective judgment and the discretion of the cabinet currently in power.
So whoever's in charge gets to decide what an existential threat is.
Precisely. And that power operates without clear legal or political restraints, which critics call hadom. The original constitutional architecture was designed to have clear, unbreachable brakes on military action. Now, those brakes are effectively replaced by a political interpretation that changes depending on who holds the majority. This lack of clear legal constraint is precisely what makes the 2015 changes so deeply unsettling to constitutionalists and pacifists.
And this all culminated in the 2015 legislation for peace and security, which formalized this right to collective self-defense.
That legislation was seismic. It didn't just formalize CSD, it dramatically expanded the scope of the self-defense forces, or SDFs, potential operational zones and roles, and it triggered the largest domestic protests Japan had seen since the 1960s.
Which is a strong indicator that while the political elites and security establishment were pushing hard for normalcy,
the public remained deeply uneasy. The public discomfort wasn't just about peace, it was about the fear of the government becoming a party to remote conflicts in which Japan has no immediate interest.
Which brings us right up to the present day. The final nail in the coffin for the Yoshida Doctrine, the abandonment of the last symbolic restraint. That came in 2022 with the 3 security documents.
Yes, these documents represented the definitive break. They formalized the decisive move to shatter the symbolic 1% cap and committed Japan to raising defense spending to the NATO standard of 2% of GDP by 2027. This solidified the shift away from a highly constrained, economically focused posture to one aimed at proactive, robust deterrence. When you look at the commitment to acquiring counterstrike capabilities and these massive budget increases, the message is clear. The long peace, as Japan knew it, is over.
That sets the necessary philosophical and historical context. Now we have to dive into the specific consequences of this shift, starting with that staggering price tag, the conflict stemming from the defense budget. This is the zero-sum trade-off that has those elderly protesters in Shinjuku worried about their life insurance.
This is where the sheer scale of the investment becomes impossible to ignore. The government has approved a $43 trillion 5-year defense buildup plan running from fiscal years 2023 through 2027.
$43 trillion.
To put that in perspective, that's 1.6 times the size of the previous 5-year plan. It's a massive, unprecedented commitment designed to fundamentally rebuild and modernize Japan's military apparatus, turning it into a force capable of sustaining prolonged, complex operations.
And the specific budget number driving the current political debate is that record $9.04 trillion draft budget for fiscal year 2026?
Correct. That single-year figure pushes annual spending close to 1.8% of GDP already, but the stated target, which is the international benchmark they are aiming for, is 2% of GDP by 2027.
And to hit that 2% target, which you estimate requires around $11 trillion annually?
Assuming minimal economic growth, yes. They have had to get extremely creative with their financial projections and, frankly, with their accounting.
This sounds like the infamous 2% accounting trick. What specific budgetary maneuvers are they using to bridge that gap and reach the 2% goal?
This is a crucial detail because it reveals the political pressure to meet that international 2% standard. Reaching that goal requires including over $2 trillion from budget items that, historically, were never counted under the Ministry of Defense's core spending.
Such as?
The major items being included are allocations for the Coast Guard, which has significant operational duties around the disputed Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, defense-related R&D managed by other agencies, and even public infrastructure deemed necessary for national security, like hardening airports and ports for potential military use.
So they are essentially taking money that would have been spent anyway on Coast Guard patrols or public works and just rebranding it as defense spending to meet a NATO metric.
Precisely. It's a political move aimed at satisfying the international community, especially Washington, that Japan is finally meeting the benchmark, and it minimizes the immediate, explicit financial shock to the core defense budget, which would require even more unpopular tax hikes.
Regardless of the accounting tricks.
Right. It still represents a huge allocation of finite resources, and that leads directly to the financing, the buildup, and the social contract conflict.
I find the public response to this pivot fascinating. They seem to agree in principle, that Japan needs a stronger defense in a dangerous neighborhood, yet they overwhelmingly reject the financial consequences of that decision.
Polling data is incredibly clear on this paradox. While approximately 55% of respondents support the abstract idea of a defense buildup, the moment the conversation turns to the cost, to how to finance it, the consensus just collapses.
So what did they say when asked how to pay for it?
Only a meager 9% supported financing the defense increase through tax hikes. The largest group, around 34%, preferred cuts in other unspecified areas of the budget.
That highlights the painful political reality. No one wants to pay for the shield or the spear. But resources, especially in a fiscally constrained Japan, are a zero-sum game.
It is the ultimate zero-sum dilemma, and the government's attempts to fund it are incredibly modest compared to the scale of the $43 trillion plan. The current plan to raise corporate, income, and tobacco taxes. It's projected to generate only about $1 trillion annually by the final year of the plan.
Which leaves a massive funding gap.
An enormous funding gap over 5 years, which forces the government to find alternatives, either making significant cuts elsewhere in the budget, issuing government bonds, which adds to the already massive national debt, or betting heavily on unrealized economic growth to magically boost tax revenues. None of these options are politically or fiscally comfortable.
And this brings us right back to the protesters' fear of domestic betrayal. When we talk about cuts elsewhere, they immediately think of social services, especially given Japan's demographic structure.
They have every reason to be worried, and this is where the conflict becomes most acute and most human. Japan is simultaneously operating a massive gargantuan social safety net to cope with its status as the world's super-aged society. The proportion of people aged 65 or over has reached a record 29.3%.
And the cost of that is immense.
Annual Social Security spending, pensions, healthcare, elder care is absolutely enormous. It's reaching around $38.3 trillion and climbing every single year.
That is a staggering contrast. You have $38.3 trillion dedicated to caring for the oldest society on Earth, an absolute necessity, while simultaneously the government is scrambling to find $9.04 trillion, eventually aiming for $11 trillion for Tomahawk missiles and hardened bases.
It's a profound political choice. It's prioritizing external security in a great power game over acute, immediate, existential domestic needs like sustaining the healthcare system and addressing the plummeting birth rate, which is now below 700,000 annually.
So the protesters' concern is absolutely rational.
Completely. Every defense dollar spent truly feels like stolen healthcare or vanished elder care because of that zero-sum reality. The erosion of the social contract is real because the unwritten agreement of the post-war era was, we guarantee political stability and economic comfort by deferring military spending. That agreement is now being rewritten in favor of security anxieties, demanding a sacrifice of domestic well-being.
That clarifies the impossible cost. Let's move to the substance of the shift. Where is this massive $43 trillion investment actually going? Is it just buying a bunch of high-profile, shiny new American weapons? Or is the strategy focused on fixing deeper, more systemic problems?
The initial investment, well, surprisingly, it's much less glamorous than the headlines might suggest.
Yeah.
The security documents focused on fundamentally reinforcing defense capabilities. And what that really meant was rectifying decades of chronic neglect within the self-defense forces.
The neglect that came from prioritizing the peace dividend.
Exactly. The strategy is to move from a hollow force that looks good on paper to a force that's actually capable of sustained operations.
Give me the most striking examples of this priority on resilience and sustainment. This sounds like they're focusing on logistics over firepower.
Absolutely. Resilience and sustainment received the single largest allocation in the 5-year plan, $15 trillion, which is a 6-fold increase over the previous planning period.
A 6-fold increase.
That huge jump reflects the sober realization that Japan could not sustain a conflict for more than a few days due to severe operational deficits.
Wait, so for decades, the world's third largest economy couldn't even afford to put air conditioning in its military barracks. That level of neglect, it speaks volumes about how deep that peace dividend philosophy ran.
It speaks volumes about the priority given to the military. We're talking about basic needs that were just starved of funding. Look at the specific numbers. The budget for equipment maintenance and sustainment has been increased by a massive 80% just to address chronic shortages of replacement parts and low operational availability across their fleet.
So planes that couldn't fly, ships that couldn't sail.
To some extent, yes. Ammunition allocation jumped by 3.3-fold. because the SDF simply didn't possess enough reserves to sustain operations beyond a short skirmish. And yes, facility spending saw a 3.3-fold increase. For example, funding for air conditioning in military facilities was previously budgeted at a minimal $2 billion, but that is rising substantially to $42 billion in the next budget. That's the difference between treating the SDF as an essential fighting force and treating it as a neglected relic.
That detail about the air conditioning perfectly illustrates the decades of systemic neglect. But more seriously, if they're worried about an initial missile strike, neglects in facilities can be deadly.
Precisely. They are focusing heavily on hardening bases. This is a critical deficiency. Analysts found that Japan currently has only about 80 hardened aircraft shelters across all U.S. and Japanese bases in the country.
80. That's it.
That's it. In a high-intensity conflict, that lack of protection means the air SDF is highly vulnerable to an initial missile strike. Some media reports suggested the capability could be destroyed in 15 minutes. A huge portion of that $15 trillion sustainment budget is going toward fixing these basic yet existential security deficiencies and establishing resilient supply lines in the southern islands.
That paints a picture of a military that was functional only as a shield, focused purely on territorial defense. But the strategic pivot everyone talks about, the signal to the region, is the shift toward the spear, the acquisition of counterstrike.
This is the definitive strategic departure from the Yoshida Doctrine. The rationale is purely realist. They realized that ballistic missile defense alone, which Japan had spent billions on, is insufficient, particularly against China's massive and rapidly growing missile threat and North Korea's increasingly diverse nuclear arsenal. To establish credible deterrence, Japan must possess the ability to credibly threaten retaliation by striking back at the adversary's launch sites.
But given Article 9 and Senchuboe, they can't call these offensive weapons or admit to a preemptive capability. What is the delicate policy nuance they are using to justify this?
They are walking a very careful semantic and legal tightrope. The 2022 National Security Strategy had to maintain that line. It explicitly forbids preemptive strikes, defined as striking first, when no armed attack has yet occurred.
Oh, yeah?
Counterstrike capability is reserved solely for a retaliatory capacity within the strict bounds of self-defense, striking the adversary's military sites after an attack on Japan has commenced and the threat is confirmed. This is their way of claiming offensive tools but framing them strictly for defensive purposes, respecting the long-standing 3 conditions for the use of force. They are acquiring the means to launch a preemptive strike, but legally reserving the right only to launch a retaliatory one.
What specific assets are being acquired to establish this long-range counterstrike capability?
The most immediate and high-profile acquisition is the purchase of 400 U.S. Tomahawk cruise missiles, the Block 4 and V variants. This is incredibly significant.
Why is it so significant?
Japan is only the 3rd country, after the US and the UK, to acquire this advanced long-range asset. Their range is about 1,600 kilometers, which brings Chinese and North Korean military bases, command centers, and launch sites well within striking distance. It is an immediate and powerful enhancement of their deterrent credibility.
And they are also investing heavily in upgrading their own domestic capabilities, which suggests they don't want to be entirely dependent on imported U.S. technology forever.
Absolutely. There are extensive plans for indigenous upgrades to their Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles. They're extending their current 200-kilometer range significantly, first to 900 kilometers, and eventually aiming for 1,500 kilometers.
So a dual-track approach.
Exactly. Immediate capability enhancement using proven U.S. assets like Tomahawk, alongside serious long-term investment in domestic missile technology. Additionally, they are investing heavily in future tech like the development of indigenous hypersonic missiles and hypervelocity gliding projectiles, which are notoriously difficult for existing missile defense systems to detect and intercept.
This strategic shift isn't just focused on technology, but on geography. We're seeing a major shift to the Southwest in terms of deployment and planning.
Historically, Cold War planning focused almost entirely on the Soviet threat in the North. Today, the strategic focus has overwhelmingly moved south and west to the Nansei or Ryukyu Island chain, which stretches from Kyushu down toward Taiwan.
And Japan's westernmost island, Yonaguni, is only 110 kilometers from Taiwan.
Right, which makes the entire island chain the new critical front line.
What does this shift look like on the ground for the residents of these remote islands?
It means the persistent deployment of coastal observation units, surveillance systems, and missile batteries on islands like Yonaguni and Amami Oshima. The strategic goal is to establish a robust anti-accessoria denial defense, making any Chinese invasion attempt of Taiwan, which would likely involve operations through this chain, too costly to bear.
And they're also working on civil defense.
Crucially, yes, they're moving to establish supply hubs on Okinawa and aggressively improving civil defense and evacuation plans in these remote locales. That's a necessary, if frightening, measure that was shamefully neglected for decades, further cementing the fact that these islands are now viewed as potential conflict zones.
Now we transition to the final set of conflicts, the geopolitical and domestic dilemmas that make this entire endeavor so deeply complex and fraught. Let's start with the external pressures, the core security concerns driving this rapid shift. Why now?
Japanese planners use the term. The security environment is as severe and complex as it has ever been since the end of World War II. This urgency is driven by three compounding factors. First, China's growing military power, its aggressive gray zone tactics around the Senkaku-Ryu Islands, and the massive increase in military exercises near Japanese waters.
And North Korea.
Second, North Korea's expanding nuclear arsenal and its testing of new, long-range ballistic missiles that can reach any part of Japan. And third, policymakers view the prospect of a Taiwan Strait contingency as an immediate, direct security threat to Japan.
Why is the Taiwan conflict a direct security threat to Japan?
Because of geography and logistics. Taiwan sits directly next to the crucial shipping lanes Japan relies on for energy and trade. More importantly, U.S. military bases in Okinawa and mainland Japan are absolutely essential for any defense of Taiwan.
So if conflict erupts,
those bases, and thus Japan, will be the first targets of Chinese missile strikes. Japanese security planners simply cannot separate their own fate from Taiwan's.
That immediately highlights the paradox of the U.S. alliance. Japan is betting the house on the alliance holding, investing $43 trillion in capabilities designed to complement the U.S., yet simultaneously they're exhibiting high levels of doubts about U.S. reliability.
That doubt is the single most important psychological factor driving the need for indigenous counterstrike. Japan's deep reliance on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, the core of extended deterrence, is being profoundly questioned. This skepticism isn't just political, it's strategic.
What do you mean by that?
Analysts openly discuss the possibility that the U.S. may be deterred from coming to Japan's defense by Chinese or North Korean missile threats targeting U.S. cities. The cost of intervention may simply be too high for a future U.S. president.
This uncertainty means the traditional structure of the alliance, that famous division of labor, is fundamentally breaking down.
It is. The traditional arrangement was the shield and spear division. Japan was the shield, providing territorial defense and rear area support for U.S. assets. The U.S. was the spear, providing the offensive punch, the long-range deterrence, and the nuclear umbrella.
But now Japan is acquiring its own spear.
Exactly. Japan acquiring counterstrike capability means it is now wielding a spear of its own, an extremely expensive indigenous one. And this shift is generating huge technical and doctrinal challenges, demanding urgent efforts to determine a unified command and control structure and clarify exactly how Japanese and U.S. forces will integrate their operations and divide roles in a shooting war scenario.
Okay. Let's turn inward to the most severe structural limitation facing this massive military expansion, a problem money simply cannot solve, the demographic constraint. This issue isn't money, it's people.
This is an existential crisis for the SDF. Japan relies on an all-volunteer force, but it's struggling against two insurmountable forces: a shrinking working-age population and intense competition for talent in a tight labor market.
What do the numbers look like?
The official numbers are sobering. In fiscal year 2023, the JSDF signed up on a 51% of its recruitment goal. That is the lowest figure ever recorded.
51%. That is staggering. Even if they had infinite funds to buy every piece of hardware they needed, they lack the personnel to fill the ranks, maintain the equipment, and execute these complex missions. How is this crisis compounded by cultural factors?
The demographic crisis meets cultural aversion. Despite the professionalization of the SDF, many Japanese parents remain deeply wary of military careers due to historical anti-militarism, the perceived poor quality of life, and limited prospects compared to the corporate sector.
And it goes beyond just the troops on the ground.
It does. The crisis extends beyond just troops. The defense industry and even the Ministry of Defense bureaucracy itself lack sufficient specialized staff. We're talking engineers, skilled technicians, procurement managers to implement the massive expansion and modernization plans, leading to inevitable delays and cost overruns. They're trying to leverage automation and AI to mitigate this, but it is not a complete remedy for the manpower shortage when you need highly trained human operators.
This demographic reality, combined with the U.S. reliability question, has clearly sparked a high-stakes debate over future strategic options, the different paths Japan could take.
Analysts generally define Japan's options on a spectrum. Plan A+, which is their current defined strategy, involves deepening the U.S. alliance, aggressively building indigenous conventional capabilities, and expanding security partnerships with other democracies like Australia, the UK, and India.
And this is considered the most realistic path.
It's the most realistic and least expensive path, despite the lingering reliability concerns. It relies on maximizing external support while minimizing full-scale rearmament costs.
But the shadow of Plan B, strategic autonomy, looms large, and that discussion inevitably leads to the most extreme and taboo option.
Indeed. Strategic autonomy means preparing to cope with potential U.S. retrenchment, becoming truly self-sufficient. In the minds of some strategists, full autonomy inevitably leads to the remote prospect of developing a domestic nuclear deterrent.
Which is still politically radioactive.
It is, but it's no longer an unspoken taboo. Leaders and strategists are increasingly broaching the subject, noting that the reluctance to even discuss the option is eroding. Most tellingly, there is a severe erosion of a long-standing post-war principle. Leaders are now reviewing the 3 non-nuclear principles, which prohibit building, deploying, or introducing nuclear weapons into Japan, to prepare for the worst-case scenario where they might need a nuclear deterrent to maintain sovereignty.
The fact that the taboo is even being discussed signals the depth of the security anxiety.
Absolutely.
So finally, let's synthesize how all these epoch-making policy decisions, the massive budget, the counterstrike, the pivot, were actually implemented politically. Was this truly the will of the people, or was it a directive from above?
The policy formation process shows a fascinating and instructive split between elitism and pluralism. Policies most related to expanding the combat power and freedom of operation of the SDF, which are the most militaristic, most radical measures, were consistently enacted without majority support from measured public opinion polls.
Which strongly suggests that political elites drove the core remilitarization agenda.
It does. For instance, measured support for increasing the military capability of the SDF never reached majority levels, yet the government relentlessly pursued legislative changes like CSD and the acquisition of counterstrike.
So the government prioritized what it saw as essential for national security over public consensus, ignoring the public's clear skepticism toward taking on offensive roles.
Precisely. They were being responsible leaders, in their view, taking necessary but unpopular steps. Now, contrast this with the areas where the government did align with the public, which we called the pluralist policies.
The purely defensive and non-combative roles.
Exactly. Policies related to territorial defense efforts, addressing maritime piracy, or participation in UN peacekeeping operations consistently enjoyed high levels of public support, and government action aligned perfectly with those views. The public was comfortable with the shield and humanitarian work, but never fully embraced the spear.
So the conclusion is clear. The core existential transformation of the SPF into a conventional military power, the acquisition of long-range offensive freedom and capability, was fundamentally driven by political elites pursuing normalcy and responding to undeniable geopolitical threats, even as they were forced to respect the public's desire for purely defensive capabilities in other, less controversial areas.
That synthesis captures it perfectly. Japan is transforming its security posture to maintain deterrence in a rapidly dangerous region. This entire pivot is driven by perceived external threats, like China and North Korea, and profound internal doubts about U.S. reliability, the very foundation of their post-war peace.
The current endeavor is an epochal reprioritization. It's a multi-layered strategy, cultivating the U.S. alliance as the essential bedrock, building a capable conventional military of their own, and expanding partnerships across the Indo-Pacific. But they're trying to execute this profound transformation while simultaneously wrestling with deep-seated anti-militarism, debilitating demographic constraints, the lack of people to fill the ranks, and the steep fiscal cost of redefining national identity in a zero-sum budget environment. They're trading the comfort of the peace dividend for the anxiety of hard sovereignty.